I very much see my work across both art forms as trying to, not just tell Indigenous stories, they're often overlooked and marginalized, but also to bring back to life the traditions of storytelling that were nearly wiped out by colonization, but that I think still, get at a lot of the truth of the world.
Hi, I'm Tamara, and this is TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Julian Brave NoiseCat's story begins with his family. In his new book, We Survived the Night, and his Oscar-nominated documentary, Sugarcane, Julian shows how personal stories are inseparable from the larger history of colonial violence. His work reveals how survival is a way of resisting, remembering, and carrying culture forward. I hope you enjoy the conversation. This podcast is brought to you by TELUS Smart Home Security. Secure, simplify, and easily monitor your home from anywhere using the Smart Home Security app. Visit TELUS.com/smarthome-security to learn more about Canada's most trusted security provider. Hi, Julian. It's really good to see you.
Oh, it's so good to be in conversation with you.
So I rewatched Sugarcane again last night, knowing that we would be chatting this morning. You have a new book that's about to be released. What did you decide to write your book? Would you call it a memoir?
It's a combination of memoir, reportage, and mythology, probably be the right way to put it. So it's narrative nonfiction, creative nonfiction.
Yeah, I love that. So I don't have a hard copy here with me. I know you do. You have the British version, the UK version?
I have the Profile Books edition that comes out the UK and Commonwealth. This happens to be the only one that I have on hand first. Yeah.
What does it feel like to hold it?
Really special, actually. Yeah. I mean, I haven't really even gotten a chance to. I honestly literally just opened up the box this morning because I figured I might need one for this. And I also gave one as an entry into this place I'm using to record this interview. I gave one to my friend's father.
Amazing. It's quite an accomplishment. I mean, you must feel. How does it all feel? There's so much I want to talk to you about. Obviously, we're going to talk about your book, but I do want to sort of rewind it a little bit because there was so much attention around Sugarcane, and deservedly so. How does that feel to now be on the other side of that?
I mean, it's been a really it's been a crazy ride with Sugarcane, and now to have my first book coming out in the same year that we were nominated for an Academy Award with Sugarcane is it's quite the year. It's been a big year of work and life for me. So I feel really grateful for it. I feel a little bit tired sometimes. There's parts of this that I'm still processing, parts that have been wonderful, parts that have been hard. But I just feel really grateful to get to tell stories and make art for a living. And the thing that's interesting about Sugarcane is that I didn't imagine myself becoming a filmmaker when I was a kid, but I did imagine myself becoming a writer. So Sugarcane was like this thing that kind of happened to me, that I obviously directed, but also was something that I didn't necessarily imagine myself becoming as an adult. And whereas We Survived the Night, my book is something that I've really dreamt about, writing for basically my entire life.
And how long? I mean, everybody I've talked to who's written a book is like, it is not easy. It is not easy to write a book. It takes a long time, a lot of commitment. It seems easy to the outside, because we're holding the book. We get to read it. And it's like, oh, yeah. How long was that process for you?
It depends on how you count it. I got the book contract just a couple months actually before we started filming Sugarcane, actually. So that of itself is a bit of a story if we wanted to get into that. So that was 4 years ago in 2021. So you could say it took 4 years. There's reporting in this book that goes back to 2018, and then it's got its primary through line is memoir. It's a father-son story about myself and my dad and his dad, and you could say that is my entire lifetime and other lifetimes as well. So it really depends on how you see it.
Yeah, I like that it's a lifetime. I mean, it really is when you're writing the kind of book I think that you just wrote, right? It's your life. It's your dad's story. It's your family story.
Yeah, even more than that, it is both of those things. It's also, it's trying to bring back to life a form of storytelling that has essentially died out among my own people because of the residential schools, because of colonization, called the Coyote story. And some of the elements of the Coyote stories, the Coyote stories are a form of creation story. They essentially are how my people narrate the creation of the world through one of our mythic ancestors, a trickster named Coyote, who was sent to the earth by the creator to set things in order and did a lot of good. He, filled the river with salmon and populated the lands with people and did all sorts of great works. At the same time, he was a trickster, so he messed a lot of stuff up. And he was also one of our first ancestors, so he's kind of our account of why we are the way we are, a little bit tricksterly, perhaps. Um, and so the elements of those stories actually date all the way back to the end of the last ice age, when the ice dams broke and the first salmon went up the rivers. So, in a way, it is definitely, a memoir and family story, but it is also trying to bring back to life a form of storytelling that stretches back literally thousands of years, like 10,000 years. And, also is nearly gone because of, unfortunately, the history of colonization and assimilation.
How did you learn how to tell stories like that?
Well, I had only ever heard someone tell a coyote story out loud once in my entire life, and it was one of my uncles. His name was Uncle Bucky, and he's gone now, actually. And he was one of in the book I read about my grandfather, who was a bit of a character. He was an Indian cowboy who had 19 kids who I could name, probably over many more than that. And in the book, I write about how he kind of single-handedly helped bring our people back from a genocide. And so it was actually one of his strays. Essentially, Uncle Bucky wasn't raised by my grandfather, and didn't know that his dad was my grandfather until he was like in his 50s, 40s. Um, and he was the only one I've ever heard tell a coyote story in my entire life, and he's not with us anymore. So this art form really has, in my family, in my community, my nation, it's essentially not practiced anymore. And I learned it through a bunch of ethnographies, like 100-year-old texts created by the Jessup North expedition, in particular by an ethnographer named James Tate, who was married into the Nlakatmuk people. And, I was essentially, the stories is that I moved in with my dad for 2 years while I wrote We Survived the Night and made Sugarcane. You don't really see that in the film, but I do write about it in the book. And while I was hanging out with my dad, I was spending the days doing my writing and research and working on the film. And while I was reading these, old coyote stories from over 100 years ago, I kept realizing that this figure that was the coyote, was our trickster ancestor, seemed a lot like my dad. He seemed like a lot like my uncles. He seemed a lot like my grandfather. And, I think that led me to a greater appreciation of these stories, and then, led me to try to use them as a way to tell a story about contemporary Indigenous life, across Canada and the United States today, because of course these stories were a way that we, understood ourselves and our history and our land. And so I essentially believe that they can still do that, that they, within the coyote stories, I see so much of my own family, my own people, and so many of the truths of the world more broadly. And if you look out at current events, it's hard for me not to see, for example, the work of a trickster president, really shaping the world right now.
So if somebody's listening and they don't know what you mean by trickster, what is a trickster?
A trickster is a figure who helps create the world, and is also a little bit of a con man when they do it. So for example, when we talk about the trickster Coyote and his greatest work, one of his greatest things that he did in our narration of the creation of the world was that he led the salmon up the rivers. He liberated them from a couple of witches who were hoarding them at the mouth of the Fraser River at the beginning of the beginning of time, essentially. And then he used those fish to, distribute them to all the people. So it was a really important, thing in the creation of our world, because my people still derive about half of our calories every year from salmon. If you're in Vancouver, you know that salmon is essential to, the entire west coast of Canada. At the same time, though, he used those salmon to his own advantage. He tried to marry into as many communities along the Fraser River as he possibly could using the salmon, because he was out for his own good. He'd been an unsuccessful bachelor up until that point, and now he had all the fish in the world, and he was going to use them to, arrange as many marriages for himself as he possibly could. And so essentially a trickster is a kind of a, confidence man, a kind of con artist like that, who, on the one hand is doing, great good, is doing something that still feeds us and fills our bellies to this day. And on the other hand is using that to his own advantage, right? Is using that to enrich himself, and his own legend.
Now you've used two different mediums, right? You've done a documentary that really has reached the highest level of recognition, being nominated for an Oscar. And now you've written a book, which is something you've always wanted to do. What is the difference in those storytelling techniques for you?
I don't see them as that different. I mean, nonfiction is still nonfiction. And, the way that you think about stories is still pretty similar. And I see my mission in both art forms to be essentially the same, which is, to help bring to life, not just the stories of my own people, but also the storytelling traditions of my own people. In Sugarcane is a film about a form of spiritual colonization, but also a form of spiritual reconciliation and healing, between myself, my father, and his mother, and as well as other members of, the broader Secwepemc Nation and community that was impacted by St. Joseph's Mission, the Indian residential school, at the core of that documentary. And to tell that story, we had to be attuned to not just the, investigative facts, which, it's worth saying that Sugarcane is the first major work in any medium to document a pattern of infanticide at any Indian residential school in the entire continent. So this was a significant work of journalism, in addition to, being a highly reviewed film. But, it is also important to point out that when we're talking about things like, our relationship between, ancestors and ourselves, between those who've walked on and the present, and the possibility that, these things have agency, these forces are alive in our lives, which is something that Indigenous peoples have always acknowledged within our own storytelling traditions, as have Catholics, it's worth pointing out. That we're talking about a form of nonfiction storytelling that is, not secular in the way that traditional journalism and documentary are. That is, attuned to types of truths, emotional truths and spiritual truths that are often overlooked in newsrooms and traditional, sit down talking head documentaries. The same thing is, I'd say, true in the way that I approached writing We Survived the Night. It is a combination of investigative, hard-hitting journalism. I traveled to Indigenous communities all across Canada and the United States to write this book. It's got elements of memoir and family history. It's got elements of criticism. But ultimately, it is structured and told in the tradition and style of a coyote story, which is, a form of nonfiction storytelling from my own people's culture. And, I very much see my work across both art forms as trying to, not just tell Indigenous stories, they're often overlooked and marginalized, but also to bring back to life the traditions of storytelling that were nearly wiped out by colonization, but that I think still, get at a lot of the truth of the world, the truth of my family, absolutely, the truth of my people, our land, and also, the truth of the world more broadly. And I think that literature, the humanities, film, philosophy, etc., need to take those traditions seriously, because they've been on this land for thousands of years. And, of course, they have insights to hold about what it is to be not just Indigenous, not just to be, a person of this land, but what it is to be human.
Wow. Yes. Yes to all of that. There's intimate stories in your storytelling. I mean, you're sharing intimate family stories. Um, do you get permission to share those stories? Do you need permission to share stories? Do you know what I mean? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, of course. I mean, so, as I said, I moved in with my dad for 2 years while we wrote We Survived the Night and made Sugarcane. So, I think that one of the things that is, I would say, I do nonfiction art. Documentary is a nonfiction art form. It's about the truth. We Survived the Night is a narrative nonfiction book. Ultimately, everything in this book is rigorously fact checked and reported and researched. And that what's unique, I would say, about nonfiction is, it's about how you choose to live your life and observe the world, which I think is one thing that nonfiction has up on fiction, right? Like in fiction, you can write something in whatever way is the most artful and creative. And if you're making a fiction film, you can stage it and light it and, do as many takes as you need and all that sort of stuff. But there is something I think special about the fact that in nonfiction, whether it's writing or filmmaking, you get to live the story. It's about not just, what's happening, but it's about how you choose to observe it and how you choose to live your life amidst and alongside it. And if you think about, the significance of that, if you come from, a people whose way of life, whose way of seeing the world, whose way of storytelling was nearly annihilated by the Indian residential schools, by, colonization, that is a very, deep existential question. And so I would say what has been really special about, these two projects and what they have called me to do is they've called me to live my life in a more Indigenous way. By moving back in with, my father, for example, who still owes me money for, coming to that I had to lend him to come to my own high school graduation. And also, by calling me to live, a lot more purposefully and with my family in Cannon Lake in the Secwepemc Nation. I grew up, it's worth saying, 1,000 miles away in a different country in the United States. And, this film and this book really brought me home in a way, and also, led me to, take on additional cultural commitments within my own community. In the book is itself structured around, 4 days of a 4-day and 4-night fast without food and water that I committed to for 4 years while I wrote the book and made We Survived the Night or made Sugarcane, excuse me. Because I, wanted to pray that these very hard stories that I've set out to tell, the stories about a cultural genocide that has, to this day traumatizes my family, that those hard truths are gentle with my loved ones, and that, hopefully they help raise greater awareness and bring greater compassion and understanding to this essential chapter of North American history.
I can't believe that there are people still to this day who deny the truth from people who lived it. Um, I I don't understand why we can't accept the stories, the lived experience and stories of people who I don't understand it, and it makes me feel, I gotta be honest, it makes me feel sick to my stomach when I watch Sugarcane or I read any of the Indigenous, I only read nonfiction, so you're speaking my language. But, when I read these books, when I interview people, like I just talked to Bob Joseph again about his newest book, right? We've had so many long conversations about the Indian Act and residential schools and the 60s scoop. And yet we still live in a country where people deny that this even happened. How, we know we can't have reconciliation unless we speak the truth. Yet why are people so scared of the truth?
I mean, I think that it's a fundamentally unsettling kind of history. I think that if you look at the truth in all its awfulness about what happened, on this land to First Peoples, to our children, the fact that multiple generations of Indigenous peoples were denied the basic right to parent their own kids, to practice our own languages and cultures. In some instances, we're not allowed to even leave the Indian Reserve that we were, stuck onto. I think that leads to a series of questions that I think would require us to radically rethink, you know, our conception of the country that we live in, and you know, might lead to ask questions like, what would it be to invest the same amount into, making sure that Indian kids can learn how to speak our languages and practice our cultures and all that sort of stuff? What would it be if there was a national effort, to build up the first peoples of this land in the same way that there was a national, society-wide effort to tear us down? And I think that, it's also worth pointing out how wide-ranging, that conspiracy, and I use that word purposefully, against Indigenous peoples was. This was not just, a few isolated schools. It wasn't just the 139 Indian residential schools across the country, which is a large number, by the way. It was also the banks that were lending to them. It was the law enforcement agencies that were removing the kids from their families and also, coercing families with the threat of, penalties and potential jail time. It was the media that created the conditions for, consent for such a system. For example, in Sugarcane, we use archival footage from a CBC documentary called Through the Eyes of Children, which is beautifully shot, by the way, which is part of why we used it, but was ultimately a form of propaganda to, celebrate what Canada was doing to assimilate, Native kids. And you could go on and on. I mean, in my book, for example, I talk about the circumstances of my father's own birth and discovery in the trash incinerator at St. Joseph's Mission. It's a very troubling story. And the fact that this was, actually something that was discussed in the local paper, that this was something that was covered in the Williams Lake Tribune and then covered in a follow-up column called the Cracker Barrel Forum, in conservative small town, Williams Lake. They were asking in the Cracker Barrel Forum, a columnist named A.J. Trinkle was asking, damning questions about what was happening, what was the routine procedure. That's a direct quote, at St. Joseph's Mission that might lead, a baby to be found in the trash incinerator. And this is what was being asked, in 1959 in small town conservative Williams Lake, home to what was once the second largest rodeo in Canada, the Williams Lake Stampede. This is the kind of town we're talking about. And I think that, if we ask those kinds of questions, I think that ultimately we also have to ask hard questions about ourselves, about the ways that, our own communities, perhaps our own families, the places that we come from were complicit or actively participating in an effort to, at the very least, annihilate the culture, if not more than that, of, an entire race of people.
I'm always puzzled by why people have such, a negative racist reaction to something that is a part of history. And history is horrible at times. I mean, take a history class, somebody. Human beings can be horrific.
I think it comes from two places. I mean, a lot of this has been directed at me and my family in the wake of Sugarcane. There is a right-wing sort of, I don't tend to talk about it that much because I don't want to give it oxygen. You're asking kind of directly about it. So, I will say that I think my impression is that it comes from two places. I think firstly, there's a sense, I think, on the Catholic right in particular, and I think in general on the Christian right, that the church is an embattled institution, that, everywhere you look across liberal secular society, the church seems to be losing ground, there is some truth to that. If you go to, the church in Williams Lake, for example, which I have been to, and I should say to those folks, I go to mass with my grandmother every single year. I could, do the hymns in Sikwat Machchin if I have to, like I can do it, like this is not, it gets painted as an anti-Catholic film, which really bothers me because we portray people who were wronged by the Catholic Church, but who remain committed, faithful Catholics, like my own grandmother and like the late Chief Rick Gilbert. And so it is not an anti-Catholic film. If anything, it's asking what the church owes to still committed Catholics who were wronged by the church at these schools. That aside, my sense is that there's a feeling that in, sort of liberal secular society, the church is losing ground to other institutions, and that is part of a broader sort of unmooring of a tradition that, across certain parts of the Western world, was part of creating a cultural common ground that society could exist in. And I think that there is a feeling among, that segment of the conservative movement that that's a bad thing. And so I think that there is a knee-jerk reaction to any, critical conversation about what the Catholic Church or other churches have done, as yet another sort of attack on, the role of religion and Christianity in life. And I don't think that that necessarily is the case. Actually, I think that it's totally possible for us to have a critical conversation about Catholicism and the role of the church in Indigenous life and other life. Because, by the way, the Catholic Church has not just done bad things to Native people. Like look at Ireland and the Magdalene Laundries and many other instances. I think it's possible to have that conversation without fundamentally questioning the role that these institutions play in our lives. And I also just want to say that, like, personally, I am not Catholic, but I think that there is an important role for spirituality and forms of belief and faith and religion in our lives. I think that that's, if you look across human history, that has been something that people have sought after for the vast majority of our existence. So I actually tend to agree with that disposition towards faith, belief, and spirituality. I just think that it's possible to, walk and chew gum at the same time.
Yes. Yes. One of the things we do on the podcast is thank our guests for being here by asking them to choose a Canadian registered charity. And you chose the Fraser Region Aboriginal Friendship Center Association. And we are going to give them a gift in your name as a thank you for you being here. So thank you for choosing them. It's really important. So I really appreciate that, Julian.
Thank you for that. I just want to say real quick, the Fraser Frafka, as they're called, my auntie Annette Christopher works there. One of Ray Peters' many kids. She really looks the part too. And they've been super lovely the last week or so. I've been in Vancouver and I've needed places to like record interviews like this one. They've made a room available for me. So that's where I was actually going to be this morning, but they didn't open until 11. So that's not where I am today. But thank you to Prafka for everything that they do for, urban kids.
Well, thank you for choosing them. I really appreciate that. And thank you for sharing that with us. So you go through these really big moments in history, like Wounded Knee, but now it's come up again. When you, how does this make you feel when you hear, political leaders, if you will, talk about something in the past that maybe they don't understand?
Well, I don't think that any of us expect politicians to be historians. They're all using the past and whatever, or whatever version of facts they believe to be useful to them, or events. I don't even know if necessarily they believe that they're facts anymore, in whatever way is useful to them. And, I think what's interesting about, Wounded Knee is that it is kind of a ground zero for so much Indigenous history on this continent, in multiple directions and can have so many different symbolic interpretations. It is, I guess, just for folks who are unfamiliar, it was the site of a massacre in 1890 of some estimates put it as high as 300 Lakota people who were followers of a religion, actually a spiritual movement called the Ghost Dance, which I write about in part because the Ghost Dance and this set of beliefs about the renewal of the world, the end of the world, the renewal of the world, and the return of our way of life actually have origins in this part of the world, in the Northwest, in the interior British Columbia. My own people practiced a version of the Ghost Dance long before Wounded Knee happened. In the anthropological literature, they call it the Prophet Dance. But it's essentially the same set of ideas that then traveled over time. And you might imagine as Native people were losing our world, that this set of beliefs would be, would have some inherent draw to them, would be moving in a way. It was also the site in 1973 of a famous standoff between the American Indian movement and the federal government over treaty rights, and was very, headline-grabbing international event. So Wounded Knee represents, in a sense, both like the death of Native people of our people, and also a sort of resurgence and renewal of our resistance. It is kind of both things at once. And in that way, I think it has been, I actually have also visited there, and I write about that in the book. It has always been sort of a touch point, a place, a symbol in Native history that many different authors, Native and non-Native, have returned to. But it is also, I think, in this moment where there's so much debate about manifest destiny, a return to a sort of imperial spirit in the United States, a renewed sense of militarism that seems to be spreading to all different parts of American politics. And there were dozens, it's worth pointing out, dozens of the highest military honor, the Medal of Honor, given out to soldiers who butchered men, women, and children at Wounded Knee. And I think that it is, once again, a symbol, Wounded Knee, an event, a historical moment, a place that captures so much of, what it is to live in the wake of this history. And interestingly, I would say that this latest turn, which obviously, protecting the medals of honor for these guys is not something that I think makes any sense if you know the history. And yet, I think it is illustrative of the fact that this is a touch point in the history of this continent, and likely always will be.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you for that, because I don't think that most people, know. And so they hear that, and it's just passed on as, okay, well, that seems right, because once again, once we get out of school, and they don't teach that stuff in school, let's be honest too, right? I mean, we're getting better, but we're not quite there yet. So I do appreciate that. When you tell me just a little bit as we're wrapping up about We Survived the Night, where did the title for the book come from? And maybe you can talk just a little bit about the art on the front of the book.
Yeah. Okay. I'll do the first, the title. Okay. So We Survived the Night. The title actually is derived from Chochwinuk, which is the traditional way to say good morning in Secwepemchin, in my people's language, except it doesn't mean good morning at all. It translates to you survived the night. And I learned that word because over a decade ago, I started learning Secwepemchin from my grandmother, who's now one of the only 2 remaining fluent speakers on the Cannon Lake Indian Reserve. I'm really grateful that she's still with us. And when I was in college, I lived on the res in the summer, and I spent my evenings hanging out with my grandma, my cat, learning our language. And as you might have hear from the way that it's spoken, it's very different from English. So the entire first month, we just spent our time doing the phonology, like learning the alphabet and all that sort of stuff. But when I was learning, my cat would bring out this mug and make tea, traditional tea, swamp tea, Hudson's Bay tea. And it had Chokwinuk written on there. And so eventually I asked her what it meant, and she told me it means you survived the night. And I've always been, really taken by that word, because my mind wonders what it was to say that at various moments in my people's history. What was it to say that in the winter of 1862, 1863, when upwards of 60%, some historians say 90% of our people died from smallpox? What was it to say that in the morning after the children were taken away to the Indian residential schools? And also, what a kind of tragicomic sensibility to put that word in a dying language, which I say reluctantly, but is the truth. Our language is dying, of a woman who was sent to those very schools. And it's kind of like, I think it just gets at the sensibility of our people, the sort of dark humor sometimes, the poetry in our language. And I've always felt that there are truths embedded in our language, in our culture, that if you draw them out, are actually quite profound. And so I, from the very beginning, believed that word could be the beginning of the germ of the idea that would structure, the entire book, which eventually led me to the coyote stories and to the way that I wrote the entire thing. And so I'm really, really, really grateful to my cat for teaching me the language, and also grateful that my ancestors chose to say good morning to each other in such a deep, dark, sometimes humorous, poetic kind of a way.
Wow. I'm so glad I asked that. What about the art?
So the cover art, I'll hold up the book so folks. So this is Coyote Sees the World Clearly by Jean Quick-to-See Smith. I will try to do this story as quick as I possibly can, but while I'm on book tour, actually, I'm going to be performing a special oral chapter of the book because the Coyote stories were a performed storytelling experience for the vast majority of their history. And so the story is that Jean Quick-to-See Smith, who's one of the most significant painters of the last century, was also she would depict the trickster coyote in her artwork, in her paintings. And so when I was thinking about the cover art for We Survived the Night, I immediately thought I need to reach out to Jean Quick-to-See Smith. I got her email from a friend who's actually mentioned in the book, who has a crazy Rolodex of Indian artists because she used to have a gallery. But her one thing was I couldn't use her name because I guess they maybe had like a falling out or something. So I reached out to Jean, didn't use her name. Jean got back to me the next day and said, of course you can use my work. Just send, a couple copies to my family library. This is where the story takes a really crazy turn. The next month, in fact, it wasn't even a month later, it was like 3 weeks later, Jean died. Jean passed away. And so to the best of my knowledge, this is the last thing that she personally gave permission to use for art. And it gets even crazier because earlier this year, I was in New York, where I end up for work for various reasons. And it was the first Thursday of the month, which is the big gallery day, if you know. And so I was there to go check out some art. And as I was peeling out of a gallery, I looked to my left, and there was the Garth Greenan gallery with a retrospective of Jean Quick-to-See Smith's work. And so I walked in. I was greeted by not one, but two of her artworks representing the trickster coyote, a sculpture and a painting on the wall. And I thought, this is insane. I have to tell somebody. My dad is an artist, so I've seen a lot of gallery owners in the day. So I kind of cased the room and profiled the guy who I thought was probably the owner. Turned out he was. I told him, hey, this is who I am. This is my relationship to Jean's work. And that's when he said, that's crazy. Jean used to joke that she was going to visit me from the beyond.
No.
True story.
Wow.
So that's the coyote story. That is the version of the book cover. That is the story of Jean winking at us all from the beyond. Because, here's my point, because our people have always had a point. These kinds of things have been written off as fairy tales and fables, and I think that it's very disrespectful to believe that people can live on this land for thousands and thousands of years and to develop a tradition that is our way of understanding the truth of it all, and that there wouldn't be something to it. And you know what? I think that we ought to take it seriously.
I agree. I was just going to ask you what the bright side of everything is. And I just feel like you just told me what the bright side is, in a way, because that is so beautiful, that story, and walking into the gallery and wow. Do you have a bright side besides what you just said? Because that was really special.
Hard to top that as
It
a bright
really
side.
is hard to top that as a bright side.
The bright side is that this is actually our interview. This is the first time I've held the book in my hands. It was in the this is the UK edition from Profile Books. So it was in the cardboard boxes until literally like a minute or two before this interview. So this is really special, and I'm really grateful that you asked me.
I'm so glad that you shared that with us, because that makes it even more special if that's possible. Like when you know why something is named the way it is, when you know something about the art, because I think as consumers or, readers, we just look at the art and we don't really think much of it. But because I love memoir nonfiction so much, I always know that there's a reason for that cover. Do you know what I mean? And that was stunning. So thank you, Julian, for sharing it. Your website is julianbravenoisecat.com. You're on Instagram at jnoisecat, and on X, gosh, do you spend much time there? At jnoisecat. It's really awesome.
I mostly just retweet stuff on X now. I still don't really call it X. I still call it Twitter.
I call it Twitter too. Julian, what a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for sharing your stories with us. All the best with your book, We Survived the Night. Everyone should read it. And if you haven't seen Sugarcane, you really should go watch it again and again. So thank you so much, Julian.
Kooks Jam, really appreciate it, Tamara.
Thanks for listening to another episode of TELUS Talks with Tamara Taggart. Be sure to subscribe so you can join us every Tuesday for another conversation. You can also check out our website, telus.com/podcast, and subscribe to our YouTube channel at TELUS Talks.